Brit, you've been in the media for a long time, and television for many decades. When you saw Sam Nunberg on yesterday, did you think to yourself, I would have put him on if I were bureau chief, or I wouldn't have put him on if I were bureau chief?
Well, I very much hoped, Tucker, that I would not have, and it was worth noting that before the day was over, CNN's Erin Burnett had looked at him and said, I smell liquor on your breath. Could she have been the first and only CNN anchor to notice that the guy was probably drunk? Not only that, he is plainly a very troubled soul. And, you know, as a journalist, when you come along, you don't have to make a psychiatric diagnosis to recognize that somebody you're talking to may not be, you know, okay, and that whatever this person says may be indeed questionable. And yet this guy held sway over the airwaves, as you pointed out earlier, for hours on end, particularly on CNN, but I guess others picked it up, and it got quite a rod yesterday. And, of course, the principal thing that made the headline, Tucker, was when he said that he wasn't going to cooperate with Mueller. Well, by this morning, that was all gone, and he said, indeed, he was going to cooperate with Mueller. As a matter of fact, he has very little choice. But that was a non-story that lived all day long because it feeds this whole narrative that there's something terribly wrong and that we have an unqualified president under the influence of Russia and God knows what else. And
so to make that point, you have someone who's under the influence of alcohol to jump around in the set and humiliate himself, but not only that, degrade the person who's interviewing him. I mean, I wonder if there's a cost long-term when you do stuff like that.
Well, you know, I think, Tucker, what we're looking at here is that there's been a belief for the longest time that the Trump election was illegitimate. And there's been a sense in the media that his election constitutes a kind of national emergency because he's such an unqualified character and so likely to lead us off a cliff that it is a job of the media to join the resistance and to find out what must be behind his election, what scandals must lurk there, in order really to take him down. I mean, I think that's plainly what this is all about. The media have clearly joined the resistance, and the coverage of this, I think, has been, in the mainstream media at least, extremely one-sided. A lot of it misguided. There have been, you know, any number of stories that turned out badly all along the way. Remember, famously, CNN, the group of their senior people sitting around and saying that they had word that when Comey testified that he was going to testify, that he'd never told Donald Trump that he was not under investigation. And the next day, of course, Comey came out and testified just the opposite. You wonder how stories like that, and there have been several of them, can possibly get past these seasoned journalists if they're not on a kind of crusade, and I think they are.
Yeah, I remember when the Russians hacked the national power grid. Do you think it might help, but they didn't, of course. Do you think it might help the rest of us who were getting agitated watching this just to remind ourselves that what you're seeing is political advocacy? There's no expectation of objectivity or news. You know, what you're watching is one side waging partisan battle against the other.
Yeah, but you know, it's strikingly effective. I mean, your previous guest, you know, she really didn't want to let go of the narrative that's out there that Russia had an important effect on the election. The evidence of that, as you point out, is extremely light at best. And, you know, anything that Russia did to the tune of even $1 million a month is dwarfed by the rest of the spending and the other things that influence the outcome of elections. You know, it's something that is held on to for dear life. And I think it's distorted coverage. I think it's enraged the people who see things more clearly than that. But on and on it goes. You see it particularly in the character assassination of Devin Nunes, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, who's had to put up with unbelievable assaults on him. And they continue to this day that he is the guy who's at fault, when you know that on the Democratic side, feeding the press, there's this unbelievable leak fest out of that committee. And it goes on and on. It's not a proud moment for the American news media, in my judgment.
Heilman over at MSNBC called Nunes, quote, a Russian agent. I mean, you would get 2 years ago, you'd be fired for saying something like that if you couldn't support it. But he's obviously not going to. Well,
it borders on hysteria. Well, I mean, it's just so over the top. I mean, you don't have to be a Trump admirer to realize that the things that are being said are just wildly out of proportion to anything real beneath them.
Well, it's insane. I know people who hate Trump who agree with that completely, the honest ones. Brit, thank you very much.
You bet, Tucker.